The Lancaster was one of Britain's most feared aircraft of the Second World War. People knew its sound before they saw it. RAF crews knew what it demanded from them. German cities knew what could follow when that heavy shape moved through the night. Across occupied Europe, the opening of a bomber's bay usually meant one thing: destruction. But in the final days of April 1945, Britain sent Lancasters low over German-occupied Holland with something different inside. No high explosives, no incendiaries, no raid meant to tear open a target. Food, flour, butter, meat, cheese, supplies for Dutch civilians starving in the last bitter days before liberation. The Germans still held the ground. Their weapons were still there. The aircraft still had to fly low enough to be seen and low enough to be shot at if the agreement failed. One wrong order could have turned mercy into disaster. Yet the RAF went in, and for once, the sound of a British bomber did not mean death was coming. It meant survival was falling from the sky. Before we continue, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. If you want more British WW2 stories, told with the myth stripped back and the evidence kept in view, subscribe to Defiant Britain WW2. Press the hype button and tell us which British story we should cover next. And now, let's continue. To understand why Operation Manna still matters, we have to begin with its contradiction. The Avro Lancaster was not built to be gentle. It was built to carry heavy loads across dangerous skies. It became one of the central aircraft of RAF Bomber Command, and in British memory, it stands beside machines such as the Spitfire and Hurricane as one of the great aircraft of the war. But its story is not clean. The Lancaster was admired. It was feared. It was an extraordinary piece of engineering, flown by crews who faced appalling danger. It was also tied to the most controversial air campaign Britain ever waged. For years, Bomber Command crews had climbed into those aircraft knowing they might not return. They flew through flak, night fighters, freezing altitude, navigation errors, mechanical failure, and burning skies. Their work was usually destruction: factories, railways, oil plants, ports, cities. That was the brutal logic of total war. Then, in April 1945, the same aircraft was given a task that almost sounds impossible. Not to break a target, not to punish a city, not to interrupt German transport, to feed people. That is the strange power of Operation Manna. It does not erase the hard questions about bombing. It does not make the war clean. It does not turn a heavy bomber into an innocent object. It shows something more complicated. At the end of a savage conflict, a machine built to deliver destruction became a flying lifeline. The Western Netherlands was still under German occupation. That detail is the hinge of the story. This was not a food drop over friendly ground.
It was not a victory parade from the air.
It was not a neat scene after the fighting had passed. German forces still controlled the territory. German weapons were still in position, and the Dutch civilians below were not starving because the war was over. They were starving because it had not ended soon enough. By spring 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied armies had crossed deep into Europe. Berlin was under assault. The Third Reich was being squeezed from east, west, and sky. On a map, liberation looked close. But maps do not feed people. A line moving forward does not put bread on a table. A town marked as nearly free does not repair a railway. A front line creeping closer does not warm a room where the furniture has already been burned for fuel. In the urban west of the Netherlands, around Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht, hunger had become the enemy people met every morning. The famine became known as the hunger winter. It must be handled carefully because there is no single, simple cause that explains all of it. The railway strike of September 1944 and the German response were crucial. Food transport into the Western Netherlands was severely affected. Roads, railways, and waterways were damaged or blocked. Fuel was scarce. Winter made everything harder. Occupation, requisitioning, military disruption, and the wider collapse of the war pressed down together. The result was not a dramatic phrase, it was a civilian disaster. Rations fell to desperate levels. People searched wherever they could. Some went into the countryside on hunger journeys, trading possessions for potatoes, grain, milk, or anything that might keep a family alive. Others survived on food that had once been unthinkable. Tulip bulbs, sugar beet, thin soup. Anything that might give the body one more day. The cruelty was not only that people were hungry, it was that liberation was almost visible and still out of reach. Victory was near. Hunger was nearer. The Allies knew there was a crisis, but knowing was not the same as solving it. They could not simply drive into the Western Netherlands without risk. German forces remained there, and fighting through densely populated areas could have added violence to famine. So the problem became painfully practical. How do you feed civilians who are still behind enemy lines? How do you deliver supplies into territory you do not yet control? How do you send help when roads are uncertain, railways are broken, and the enemy still holds the ground? The answer came from the air, and the answer sounded absurd until you understood the machinery behind it. Britain would send bombers. Not because bombers were natural instruments of mercy, because they could carry weight, because they could cross the North Sea quickly, because the RAF already had the airfields, crews, ground staff, loaders, navigators, planners, and aircraft needed to move supplies at scale. The Lancaster's bomb bay, made for explosives, could be packed with food. Ground crews who had loaded bombs could load sacks. Air crews who had studied routes to targets could now study routes to drop zones. The bomb aimer, trained to think in aiming points, could look down at fields where food needed to land. It was a transformation of purpose, not a disappearance of risk. The aircraft had to fly low, very low. Low enough for accurate drops. Low enough for people on the ground to see the roundels. Low enough that German guns and small arms were not distant symbols on a map. They were immediate. There were arrangements with the occupying German forces. Designated zones were agreed. German troops were instructed not to fire on aircraft taking part in the relief. But war is not a tidy office document. Orders can arrive late. A gun crew can misunderstand. A nervous soldier can fire. A local commander can still look at the aircraft overhead and see what he has been trained to see. An enemy bomber. That was the thin line Operation Manna crossed. The Germans were supposed not to fire. Supposed to. Some early flights took place before the arrangements had been fully settled, which gives the first missions their particular tension. These Lancasters were not flying into peace. They were flying into a fragile pause in the war. A pause built from negotiation, desperation, and trust that might fail at any second. Now imagine the flat Dutch landscape below. Fields, roads, villages, water channels, city edges, German positions. Hungry civilians waiting for a sound that had meant fear for most of the war. Then it came. Heavy engines, Not the distant drone of a high-altitude night raid, but something lower, closer, physical. A Lancaster coming in over occupied Holland. For years, the sound of bombers had told people to hide. It meant windows shaking. It meant fire. It meant waiting to discover where the bombs would fall. This time, the aircraft came low and slow. The bomb doors opened, and instead of explosions, sacks fell out. That is the image that refuses to die. A bomber opened its belly, and life came out. Food is a small word until there is none left. Then it becomes everything. A sack of flour is not just flour, it is bread that might exist tomorrow. A tin of meat is not just meat, it is strength returning to a body. Butter and cheese are not luxuries when people have been living on scraps. They are calories, warmth, proof that the world outside has not forgotten you. Operation Manna was not abstract humanitarian language, it was survival, measured in sacks. And the mission carried a weight unlike Britain's usual bombing operations. No one could pretend it would win the war by itself. Germany was already close to defeat. Allied armies were already moving. The end was coming. But that is precisely why the operation mattered. Almost saved no one. A war almost over could still kill. A city almost liberated could still starve. A family almost safe could still lose someone before the first troops arrived. Operation Manna existed in that narrow space between victory and survival. The name itself carried a biblical echo, manna, food from heaven. But the reality was not soft or magical. It was organized. It was loaded by ground crews. It was planned by officers. It was flown by airmen. It depended on weather, routes, drop zones, altitude, discipline, and German restraint. The romance of the story can hide the machinery, and the machinery matters. At RAF stations in Britain, sacks of food had to be brought to the aircraft and packed into bomb bays. The Lancaster's size, once valued for carrying heavy bomb loads, now made it valuable for carrying relief. That is one of the strange efficiencies of war. A system built for one purpose can be turned towards another when the need becomes severe enough. The first RAF drops began on April 29, 1945, right at the edge of the war in Europe. In Berlin, the Nazi regime was collapsing. Across the continent, the shape of victory was becoming clear. But the crisis in the Western Netherlands had not waited politely for the official end. For many Dutch civilians, liberation did not begin with a parade. It began with aircraft. Not aircraft attacking, aircraft feeding. The RAF Museum has described Operation Manna as the first humanitarian aid mission undertaken by the Royal Air Force. That description matters because it places the operation in a different moral category from the missions that made Bomber Command famous. This was not victory through destruction. It was the preservation of life before victory could physically arrive. And we should be honest about the wider Allied picture. Britain's role was central. The RAF led Operation Manna, and the Lancaster became its most memorable symbol. British airfields, Bomber Command aircraft, crews, planners, and ground staff formed the spine of the operation. But Britain did not act entirely alone. Commonwealth airmen were part of the story, including Australian crews from No. 460 Squadron RAAF. Canadian, New Zealand, and Polish airmen also served within RAF structures during the wider operation. The war Britain fought was never only the work of one island. It drew on people from far beyond Britain's shores. Then, from May 1st, the United States Army Air Forces began their own food drops under a different name. Operation Chowhound. Different name, same urgent purpose: feed the starving West before liberation could reach every street. That wider Allied effort does not weaken Britain's role. It strengthens the truth. Operation Manna was British-led, but it belonged to a larger moment when Allied air power, built for war, was briefly turned into a delivery system for survival. For once, air power was not measured by what it destroyed. It was measured by what it delivered. There is another myth worth correcting. Because Germany was nearly defeated, it is tempting to imagine the mission was easy. It was not. A nearly defeated army can still kill. A soldier with a rifle is not harmless because Berlin is falling. A starving civilian is not safe because surrender is days away. A Lancaster flying low over occupied land is not protected by good intentions. There were incidents of German small arms fire during the operations, though not the catastrophic losses that could have followed if the arrangements had collapsed completely. That balance matters. Operation Manna was not a suicidal dash through constant fire, but it was not risk-free theater either. It belonged to that strange late-war space where everyone can sense the end coming, and yet danger still sits in every misunderstanding. That is why the German guns matter. The most frightening part was not merely that they existed, it was that the whole mission depended on them staying silent. The Lancasters did not arrive to suppress them. They were not carrying bombs to strike gun positions. They came with food, and their safety depended partly on agreements made with the same occupying power whose presence had helped trap the civilians below. That is uncomfortable. Mercy had to be negotiated with an enemy still holding hungry people under occupation. War creates situations like that. The right thing can depend on arrangements with men who were enemies yesterday, remain dangerous today, and may surrender tomorrow. For the Dutch civilians, those military and political details may have mattered less than the sound overhead. They had lived through occupation, fear, shortage, and winter. They had seen liberation come close, then stall. They had watched the normal world shrink. Food, fuel, transport, warmth, certainty, all reduced until survival became daily work. Then, British aircraft arrived, not as a rumor or a distant promise, but as a physical presence above the fields. The bombers came low, the bomb doors opened, the food fell. There is a reason the image survives. It reverses the grammar of war. Bombers are supposed to take life. Here, they gave it. The sky is supposed to bring danger. Here, it brought bread. The bomb bay is supposed to carry death. Here, it carried dinner. That is not sentimental exaggeration. It is the central contradiction of the mission. A Lancaster, one of Britain's most recognizable weapons of the war, became a breadbasket with wings. Across 10 days, RAF aircraft flew more than 3,000 sorties and dropped roughly 6,500 tons of food supplies. Numbers that large can go cold in the mouth, so bring them back down to earth. A ton is not only a measure, it is sack after sack lifted by tired hands. It is aircraft after aircraft leaving Britain. It is crews returning empty, and others preparing to go out. It is a system of war turned briefly towards mercy. It is a starving city receiving proof that it had not been abandoned. That last point matters. Occupation isolates people. Famine isolates them further. Hunger shrinks the world until the next meal becomes larger than politics, strategy, or speeches. For people in the Western Netherlands, the sight of Allied aircraft dropping food meant more than calories. It meant contact. Someone outside knew. Someone had planned. Someone had loaded the aircraft. Someone had flown. Someone had decided that even with victory close, waiting was not enough. That is the moral center of Operation Manna. Not that Britain alone saved the Netherlands, not that bombers became innocent, not that war suddenly became clean. The truth is harder and stronger. Britain used one of the hardest instruments of its war to answer one of the most basic human needs: food. There is a quiet power in that. The final days of the Second World War in Europe are often told through collapse. Berlin falling, German armies surrendering, prisoners released, flags changing, leaders dead or captured, maps redrawn. Operation Manna belongs to another ending. Not the fall of a regime, the interruption of hunger. The aircraft did not announce peace. They bought time until peace arrived. And in war, time can be the difference between life and death. A Lancaster returning to Britain after a drop would have looked emptier than when it left. No bombs, no food, nothing in the bay. But that emptiness was the point. Every empty aircraft meant supplies had crossed a gap that roads and armies could not yet close. Every empty aircraft meant the machine had done something it was never designed to do. Somewhere below, people had a chance to eat. Operation Manna lasted only days, but some missions do not need months to become memory. They survive because they reveal a truth in a single image. A bomber over German guns, bomb doors open, no explosion, food falling. For Britain, it is a reminder that the war effort was not only speeches, battles, and famous victories. It was also logistics, airfields, crews, ground staff, negotiations, risk, and the ability to adapt a weapon to a humanitarian purpose when the moment demanded it. For the Netherlands, it is remembered with gratitude because it arrived at the edge of catastrophe. For Bomber Command, it remains one of the most unusual missions in its history. Not an answer to every controversy, not a clean ending to a brutal campaign, but a moment when the same force remembered for destruction helped deliver survival. That is why the story matters. History is rarely made of pure symbols. The Lancaster was not only a symbol of fear, it was not only a symbol of British engineering, it was not only a symbol of bombing. In April 1945, over the starving Western Netherlands, it became something else. A contradiction. A weapon carrying mercy. A bomber carrying bread. A machine built for war, flying low over enemy guns to keep civilians alive until freedom could reach them. And for once, when people heard the sound of a British bomber above them, they did not have to run from it. They could look up. Because what was coming down was not death. It was food.